All right, so welcome everyone. We will go ahead and get started. Sometimes this platform does not always show me what you guys are seeing. So if you can go ahead, if someone could just go ahead and throw in the chat and let me know if you can see the first slide that just says top 5 vendor onboarding best practices for the new accounts payable manager. So if someone can just go ahead and throw in the chat that they are able to see that, I will feel much more comfortable. I know it will tell me at some point, but it just does not say that here. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. So welcome to today's live webinar, the top 5 vendor onboarding best practices for the new accounts payable manager. And I say new accounts payable manager, but it can be for anyone that is either new to the vendor onboarding process or vendor setup and maintenance process, or that know that they need to implement some best practices or internal controls when it comes to onboarding their vendors or even changing existing vendors for that matter. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, some housekeeping items before we begin. This recording or this session is being recorded, and I'll send you a link within 3 days. I say 3 days, but you'll most likely get it tomorrow unless there's an issue. Feel free to submit your questions at any time, and they will be saved for the last 5 or so minutes. Hopefully I won't talk too much, but put them in at any time, and then that way I'll be able to kind of gauge when I need to stop talking and start answering questions. And if I don't get out to all of your questions during today's session, then I will respond via email within 24 hours. And then lastly, don't forget to download the handouts in the handout section. There is a PDF of this presentation along with my brochure. And for those of you that don't know me, my name is Debra R. Richardson. You may have heard of me by my saying, putting the AP in happy. I also have a podcast of the same name, which I thought I wouldn't have anything to talk about in relation to vendors, but I am on tomorrow will be episode 164. So check that out if you haven't already. But as a previous AP senior manager, I was responsible for maintaining 140,000 active global vendors across 7 different ERPs. And yes, I do mean 7 different vendor master files. And we processed about I had a team of 17, and we processed about 2,000 vendor requests per month. Now, of course, I work with accounts payable and procurement teams to make sure they clean up their vendor data, clean up their vendor processes so that they can pay the right vendor. Now, one thing to also know about me is that my favorite day of the week is Monday. So on Mondays, I post a lot of TGIM AP humor, and I'm going to share some of that as we go through today's presentation. So hopefully you'll find that humorous. All right, so let's review the agenda. So first, we're going to go over my proprietary 3-step process for authentication, validation, and management. And then we're going to look at the top 5 vendor onboarding practices. And then I'll share with you some vendor process resources, lots of free downloads. So I'll share those with you, and then I'll share with you how to connect with me. And then also we'll get into some Q&A. All right, so authentication, validation, management. This is really a process that I use for my clients that still have manual, fully manual or partially manual. And don't worry about if you have manual processes, everybody does. To ensure that they have real vendors and then also that they're avoiding fraud and then compliance fines. And so that's really important now, or everybody thinks about that now, because I know next month we're getting into 1099, 1042 reporting season. So let's look at this three-step process. The first step is authentication, which is the confirmation of the vendor data source or delivery method of the vendor documentation. So the data source is who is sending, and the delivery method can be email or vendor portal or fax or even hard copy if you're back in the office. Now, after you have, now if you have something like a vendor portal, then you can use like the vendor portal itself, as long as it has security and multi-factor authentication. That authentication process is really complete with the login process of that vendor portal. But if you are getting in that vendor supporting documentation to set that vendor up or even change that existing vendor, then you need to authenticate the requester who's sending that information. The same way that your bank authenticates you when you call in to talk about your account. They ask you multiple questions to make sure you are who you say you are. And you need to do the same thing with your vendor if you're still getting in that information via email, fax, or hard copy. Now, once you have authenticated who you've gotten that information in, now you've got that vendor supporting data, and step two is to validate that data. You want to make sure that the vendor information is accurate, and even if that vendor is not a fraudulent vendor trying to get into your vendor master file, they're your real vendor, they don't always know, right, the most accurate information. How many times have you had to send that W-9 back because they didn't give you the correct legal name and tax ID combination? So you need to verify or validate that information, put it in your conventions or standardizations that you've developed for your accounting system or ERP, especially like things like the address to make sure that it can be mailed. Now, I do have a vendor validation reference list with resource links, and it has about 25 different vendor validations and links to those validations, and it's separated by the type of document that you get that data on. So it's separated by, you know, the information you get on the W-9, the information that you can get on the invoice, the information that you could get on the on like a vendor banking letter or company branded ACH form, which we'll talk about that. But make sure you click the link and you download that. You might find a couple of validation resources that you were not aware of. Now, once you validated that information and keyed it into your accounting system or ERP, you are not done yet. Once that information gets into your system, you need to make sure that it stays valid. And that is step 3, management of that information. And really, it boils down to making sure that you are always inactivating vendors that your team or your company is no longer doing business with. So vendors that haven't had activity in, I don't know, 15, 18, 24 months, whatever works for your company, and then inactivating those vendors, and then the remaining active vendors revalidating their existing data, because you know the vendors won't tell you if they've changed anything unless it affects their payments. So you need to make sure that you're revalidating that IRS or the legal name and tax ID combination with the IRS records. You need to make sure you're validating that the vendors have not been added to one of those watch lists as you originally onboarded them. So that is step 3. Now, step 3 also includes lots of internal controls and best practices related to maintaining that information. And I do have that in, actually, I update this e-guide every year, but it's a 3-step vendor setup and maintenance process e-guide, and has everything that I just talked about. It has 5 authentication techniques, and then 12 internal controls, 13 best practices, all around this 3-step process. It is 68 pages now, I think it is, and because we're in accounts payable, we're all type A personalities. It has no fluff. It is all action items and bullet points. And if you stay to the end of this, I will give you a code where you can get 25% off. It's normally $39. $39.99, and I think 25% off is $24.99. So that'll be it for you, or I'll have that discount code for you. Now, I do have a poll question for you. Let me go ahead and get that launched. And the poll question is for U.S. vendors. Let me launch it. For U.S. vendors, do you collect the IRS W-9 and perform a 10 match against IRS records? Now, this may sound like a given, but I will tell you, I went to a conference, in-person conference for an AP organization in November, not last year, not the year before last, but this past November. And I talked with some folks, and I was like, could not believe that there are still people that do not collect or require the IRS W-9 when they're setting up vendors. And there are still some people that when they do collect it, they don't do an IRS 10 match immediately. Most of them wait until it's time, like now, that they're getting ready to do the reporting. So go ahead and let me know if you have both, if you both collect the W-9 and perform a 10 match, or if you only collect the W-9, or if you only perform a 10 match. And you might think, well, how could I only perform a 10 match if I haven't collected the W-9? Well, technically the W-9 is not required by the IRS. You could get only the tax ID is required, and you can get that via phone. I do not recommend it because it can lead to fraudulent vendors. I like the supporting documentation of having that IRS W-9, but let me know if you only perform a 10 match, not requesting or requiring the W-9, and then also if you do neither. So let me go ahead and close this out. Thank you for those that have voted. I'm going to close it, and then let me share. So it looks like, wow, so it looks like we have 25% that both collect a W-9 and perform that 10 match. That's great. 75% only collect the W-9, so you're not doing that 10 match. All right, so that's a perfect segue into the top 5 best practices for onboarding vendors. And so the first one, of course, is to collect and validate the W-9. So you want to make sure that, and 100% of everybody on the call today or on the webinar today is collecting that W-9. But you want to make sure that you also validate it against IRS records, and that is doing that 10 match. That's making sure that the legal name and tax ID combination matches, and not only for existing or new vendors, but also for collective for existing vendors as well. Because let's say you have an existing vendor that gives you an address change because they moved. Well, they moved because they were acquired by somebody else, but they don't know that that's important to you. So they're only giving you their new address so they can get their check payment, right? They're only telling you that so it doesn't mess up their payments. But you need to investigate further and make sure that there are no other changes, and you can do that by requiring or collecting that W-9 and then validating with the IRS 10 match. Another thing that will allow you to do is avoid those compliance fines, because if you file the 1099 reporting, do the tax filing with the IRS, and it has a bad legal name tax ID combination, you're going to get fined, and you are also going to be receive that vendor or those vendors on a list with the IRS's CP 2100 notice or 2100A notice, and you're going to have to follow that B notice process, which is totally manual. And then the other thing that this helps with is that you avoid duplicate vendors. And so you've got the legal name, you got the tax ID, make sure that you're entering them both into your ERP, and that you have specific conventions for that legal name, so that you're not entering it into, you can, one, search to make sure the vendor is not already in there, but two, you could enter it in a way that everybody else is entering it in, so that there won't be any duplicates in the future. And also internal team members can find the vendors as well. And then I also recommend with that tax ID that you have one tax ID per vendor record. And that's, again, to avoid the duplicate vendors. And I know those folks with systems like SAP, that is based on like relationships and business partners, and you can have multiple vendor types partnered with other vendors, and that's all based on different payment methods, different addresses, and so that's not quite possible in SAP. But everyone else, you can look into doing that to make sure that you are avoiding those duplicate vendors. And so I do recommend that you have one tax ID per vendor record. Lots of cases, it's a checkbox in your configuration, so you can check with your IT or system team for that. And then, so this is one of the, I thought it was funny, humor, AP humor that I share on Mondays, because again, Monday is my favorite day of the week. But we all have been there where we go back and forth with the vendor, and finally they get that W-9 correct. All right, so let's move on to best practice number 2, and that is a company branded ACH form. So I talked about authentication with authenticating the requester so that you know that who you're getting that information from is a valid person. But you can also go a step further, especially when vendors are changing their banking, and collect their banking information on a company branded ACH form. And you can put whatever information you want to on this form to make sure that you are dealing with the actual vendor, and to make sure that if they're changing it, that it is valid. And so I suggest that you require, if they are changing their banking, their existing banking details, or the last 3 payment deposit dates and amounts. And if they push back and say, well, I don't have the existing banking details, then you got to wonder, if they don't have the existing banking details, why on earth do they have the authority to change it? And how did they get the authority to get the new banking details? So I do recommend that it be required on there. And if it's a new vendor, I also recommend you have a section where you indicate the internal team member that they have a relationship with at your company that's ordered these goods or services. And then you can verify if something looks suspicious, you can go back to that internal employee and verify. But for changes, make sure you ask for those existing bank details. Also, have them include the full tax ID. That's another way to verify that you're dealing with the actual vendor. And it can also help you make sure you're, updating, or it matches the W-9 that you have for new vendors, and that you're updating, if you have an existing vendor, that you're updating the right vendor record. And then you can include any other company element that the vendor also has. And then optionally ask for that remit address. I don't know if anyone on here has PeopleSoft, but in PeopleSoft, you can have multiple remit addresses, you can have multiple locations, and that just helps you identify you are dealing with the right location, or even maybe site ID if you have Oracle. And then best practice is, do not post this on your website. You want to make sure that you are changing it every year, and that you are only giving it to those vendors that are either new, or if they're existing vendors that have authenticated themselves via that authentication process for the requester. Because if you get a form that is an older form, then you know that you just did not authenticate that vendor and give them the updated form, and so that can be an indication of fraud. And if you want a head start on creating that company branded ACH form, you can click the link and see if it's something you'd be interested in purchasing. Now, best practice number 3 is to validate the address, format, and status. So if any of you are used to going to the USPS and typing in, I think it's the zip code lookup tool or something that they call it, but you type that in and then you get the standardized format or how you're supposed to submit or store that address. So whatever you send is deliverable. Well, what they don't show you when they give you the results is they know and they have it in their database whether or not that address is a match, but maybe it's vacant, right? If the mail carrier delivered mail and notice that no one has picked up that mail in 90 days, they're going to take all that back to the post office and they're going to stop delivering. And the post office has that. They'll mark it as vacant, so they have that status. They also have the status of an address being inactive. And so for privacy reasons, anyone can mark their address as inactive so they don't get mail. Or maybe it's a new office building or a new subdivision, and so though those addresses are still marked as inactive. You need to know that, because if it's active or vacant, and you send those 1099s out, you're going to get them all back again. You can also find out if they are a post office box only, which can be an indicator of fraud. And so if you have one that's a post office box only, then maybe you want to reach out or make sure that you have a physical address on file. Now, the only place that I know that you can get this status from is a company called Smarty Streets. And if you're dealing with US addresses only, they give you 250 lookups for free per month. So go ahead and click that link if that's something you think you'd be interested in. And with 1099s and 1042s right around the corner, I definitely suggest that you do that. They also have a bulk upload that you can do, and they have US and international addresses. Best practice number 4 is to validate with watch lists, and then make sure you revalidate, as I talked about earlier. And so you want to make sure you're checking with OFAC, the Office of Foreign Assets and Control, because technically U.S. entities and individuals are not to do business with those any vendors that appear on that list. The same thing with System of Award Management and Office of Inspector General. So if you're healthcare organizations or any organization where you're getting federal funds, you are not supposed to be doing business with vendors that appear on any of these sanction lists or exclusion lists. And so you want to validate them when you're onboarding them, but then you also want to revalidate them periodically, again, to make sure they haven't been added to a list since you originally onboarded them. And that goes for banks as well. And the banks really come into play with OFAC. So OFAC has a list of banks that you are not to do business with as well, and so you need to check those. Now, the next one I have is for poll is for bank account ownership. And so I want to just find out if you guys are validating bank account ownership, because you could probably guess what my next best practice is. So go ahead and answer yes, no, or you're not sure if your company has bank account ownership validation. So go ahead and vote. Okay. So I'll give it maybe 10 more seconds because I think I'm talking a bit too much. We're right at 12:25, but we'll be able to get through the rest of it. So I'm going to go ahead now and close this out, and I will share. Oh, so we do have 50% says yes, they are checking bank account ownership. So that's just great. 50% says no. So this will be very interesting. Let's go ahead and move on to the next best practice is best practice. Actually, it's the last one. It is best practice number 5, banking validations. Now, it doesn't just include bank account ownership, it is also verifying the bank branch details, because the ABA routing number, the SWIFT or BIC code can change as banks merge and are acquired, which happens all the time. The last one I knew of is the BB&T and SunTrust. They merged in December 2019 to Truist. And when that happens, there's a whole new routing number. And so just think about all the vendors in your vendor master file that still had those BB&T and SunTrust routing numbers. And if you send those in your pay file, you could get a NACHA fine, be susceptible to a NACHA fine if you don't change those in an efficient manner, because your bank, or I'm not sure if your bank or your vendor's bank actually makes a change, but they'll do that a few times, but not forever. So you want to make sure that information is correct, and you also want to make sure you're using the right routing number for the right type of payment. Some are only valid for ACHs, some are only valid for wires. Now, for bank account ownership, there are options out there for U.S. banks. You can use Early Warning or GIAC, which is really a database that U.S. banks contributed their depositor information to. Those are paid services, but it is the U.S. because only the U.S. is providing the depositor information. But a company called NS Knox does provide it for U.S. and non-U.S. banks, because they use a pre-note process that the vendor triggers. And so they can provide that bank account ownership validation for not only U.S. banks, but also non-U.S. banks. And then I recently found another one with Inverity, and they provide bank account validation for banks in Canada, also in Chile and Colombia. So you do have some options. And as we get into, years where the industry, where they know that people are looking for bank account validations, not only in the US, but in other countries as well, more of these services are going to pop up. And so Inverity was one, and I think I have another one that I'm going to be researching. And then those were the 5 best practices. And so I talked about the e-guide, and here is a code, the e-guide 25 for 25% off if you want my e-guide on the 3-step process for vendor setup and maintenance. On the left-hand side here, I have tons of free resources that you can download. I have that free vendor validation reference list I talked about. I also have a free desktop procedure template, which should have been a best practice. I had a million of them. I could only pick 5. And then I also have a free W-8 expiration date tracking form, because W-8s expire 12/31 after the 3rd year of the signature. So if you're not working on that, you should be. You can download that tracking form in order to track your efforts. And then I do have lots of live and on-demand webinars like this one. And so lots of them are on my YouTube channel, and they have timestamps. And then if you're interested in more training on the vendor process, I do have a vendor team training pass, and so I have a link there for more information. And then here's how you can connect with me again on social media. If you like my TGIMs, which I'm going to show you one more, and then also my YouTube channel, where every Tuesday I post a vendor master file tip of the week. And then here's my last one, and hopefully you guys didn't think of that, as you were going through this webinar. I keep hitting the escape key, but I'm still here. I don't know, I thought that was funny. All right, so we only have a minute left. I did talk too much. I apologize, but I hope you found value in the top 5 vendor onboarding best practices. Go ahead and throw your questions in the QA section. I can respond via email, and then if you think of things afterwards, feel free to email me at deborah@debrarrichardson.com. I didn't see any questions come in, so make sure you download the PDF, and you can email me if you have any questions afterwards. All right, so I want to thank everyone for joining today. This webinar has now concluded.